Good afternoon and welcome. I am Yadira Padilla, Coordinator of Public Programs. Thank you for joining us. You may have noticed the yellow letters shortly projected on the screen behind me. This is a live captioning service. A person in another room is listening to the sound the microphones pick up, then transcribing that sound into text. Should the captioner incorrectly type a word or phrase during the program, I encourage you to lend them some grace, and I hope you find this service useful. A special thank you to High Museum members in attendance. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member of the museum or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of the program. This program is in conjunction with our current exhibition, Beatrix Potter, Drawn to Nature, which was organized by the V&A. This exhibition is currently on view and will close on January 7th. I encourage you to come back to the museum to see the exhibition before then. This exhibition was made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors: Delta Airlines, ACT Foundation, William N. Banks Jr., Cousins Foundation, Burton M. Gold, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Harry Norman Realtors, Wish Foundation, and Benefactors Exhibition Series supporters Robin and Hilton Howell. Also, thank you to the full High team for their essential support to make this program happen. Now, I will share brief biographical information about tonight's guest. Betsy Bray is based in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, following a career as a children's librarian. She was the first overseas trustee elected to the Beatrix Potter Society, with which she has been a member for almost 40 years. She has spoken at several of the Society's international study conferences and given illustrated talks to various groups in the United States, United Kingdom, Africa, and Australia. She also lectured about Beatrix Potter on a transatlantic crossing of the Queen Mary II. She has a BA in History from Curry College in Milton, Massachusetts, and a Master of Library Science from St. John's University, New York. Our next guest is Dr. Andrew Westover, the Eleanor McDonald Storza Director of Education at the High Museum of Art. An educator and ethicist, Westover helms the learning team at the High, which recently re-articulated its focus, connecting people with art and ideas to inspire better civic life. Westover's previous positions include posts at the New Museum of Contemporary Art, J. Paul Getty Museum, National Museum of Wildlife Art, Smithsonian's Institution's Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and Phoenix Art Museum. Westover began their career as a classroom educator and prior to museums worked for schools, districts, and universities across the United States and abroad. Westover holds an Master's in Education from Arizona State University, an MA in Religion from Claremont School of Theology, and a Master's in Education and a PhD in Education and Ethics from Harvard University. Please join me in welcoming Betsy and Andrew to the stage.
Hello, how are you all? Alive, present here on a Saturday when there's wonderful weather outside and you're choosing to join with us. We are very appreciative. Thank you for being here. I am thrilled to be sharing this, of course, as Yadira mentioned, in conjunction with our exhibition, Beatrix Potter, Drawn to Nature. This is, of course, coming to us from the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, and it is one of their exhibitions touring the world. But don't fear, we also have put some of our own touches on the exhibition, and so if you haven't yet seen it, we would love for you to take some time after this talk to go ahead and do that. And I am especially thrilled to be able to welcome Betsy to the stage with us today. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you, Andrew. And thank you to you and your team for your invitation here to this beautiful museum and the exhibition. It's very exciting.
We are so, so excited for you to be here to experience it. Now, you heard in Yadira's introduction that Betsy is the first international trustee of the Beatrix Potter Society, so maybe a quick round of applause for that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Betsy, how did you first come to encounter Beatrix Potter's work?
Good question. I get asked this all the time. I was not, growing up as a child, I don't want you all to be horrified, but I did not read Beatrix Potter books. But, boo, I hear that, okay. I was a Madeline fan then. But when I went to library school to be a children's librarian, I remember my professor, Harriet Quimby, holding up The Tale of Peter Rabbit and saying, "This is the most perfect picture book that was ever written," because of the marriage of the language and the illustrations. And if you're here, you all understand that as well. I went on to be a children's librarian in Connecticut at the public library, and in 1984, I was a baby back then, I found that there was a ad for the first Beatrix Potter Society study conference to be held in the UK. And I thought, wow, that sounds like fun. I think I'd like to go. So my boss was great and said, yes, you can go. And I applied for a grant from the Connecticut Library Association to go. And much to my surprise, they paid for my trip. Now, I didn't know anything about traveling to the UK. I came in the morning, the conference started, you know, awake all night, that kind of thing, driving on the different side of the road, the whole thing. But I went to the conference and I got a lot out of it and learned so much about Beatrix Potter that I really got hooked. And as we all know, when you get a grant, you have to do something in return. So what I had to do was either write an article for their journal or go around and talk about Beatrix Potter. So you can kind of guess what I ended up doing. I talked about Beatrix Potter, and as Andrew said, I'm celebrating my 40th year, so I've been doing talks for 40 years, and I'm also very excited to be doing this talk today in a different format, talking to Andrew. So that's how I got interested in Beatrix Potter, and it continued on, helping with American conferences, and all the people that I've met over the years in my experience with the Society has been wonderful. And can I say a few words about the Society as well? Sure, yes. So the Beatrix Potter Society is made up of over 500 members. We are all from all over the world. The Americans right now have the majority of the membership, but the Society is based in the UK. We have a wonderful website, so it's very detailed and interesting. So please go to our website. That's probably flashing up here behind us. We have 2 programs we do, Reading Beatrix Potter, where our members go out to schools and read Beatrix Potter stories. And then we also have Introducing Beatrix Potter, where it's kind of what I'm doing today, is talking about Beatrix Potter. So our members go out and give talks to different groups about Beatrix Potter. We also have another group that's called the North American Leadership Circle, and that's a group of Americans, and we get to meet every few months and talk about Beatrix Potter. And Helen Surratt is here in the audience. She's the head of the North American Leadership Circle, and thank you, Helen, for coming from Tennessee to see the talk. But we thank you, and we've just built up really good camaraderie through that as well, meeting people from all over the country as well.
Thank you so much for giving us that context. Okay. It's super helpful. So I think we're all here in part because we find, at a bare minimum, Beatrix Potter has a fascinating life. And there are so many things that we could talk about, but I wondered if perhaps we could talk about a part of her life that for those who come to her work from the stories may not be as well known. Now, and what we're referring to here is her engagement with scientific observation. Could you speak a little bit to how Beatrix Potter engaged with observation broadly, but specifically with scientific observation across her life?
So do we have like 2 or 3 days to answer that question? No,
of course.
I'm going to try to keep it short and sweet, but I think one of the interesting parts about Beatrix Potter was that she was born into a very wealthy family, and they spent their holidays, or what we call vacations, up in Scotland in the Lake District. London was a terrible place to stay during the summer, so they would lease houses. So she spent much of her time growing up in the summer for several months staying at these houses. And she really had freedom there to explore and walk around and wander through the woods. And later on, her brother was born 6 years after her, so he spent time with her. And I think so that they spent a lot of time in nature at that point. They would go and find a dead animal and boil it so that they could see the skeleton so that Beatrix could sketch it. I mean, there was all kinds of things like that they did. So I think that was part of it. But the other important part, I think, about her scientific observation were her parents were very supportive of this. She didn't quite get along with her mother, per se. She was very close to her father, but they really helped nurture this by sending her to lessons, giving her supplies. The other interesting thing, too, was that her father, Rupert, was a photographer. And he, back in those days, that wasn't like taking out your iPhone and taking a picture. It was kind of a big deal. He had a servant that would help. And Beatrix would go on those photo shoots. And I think that was part of it as well, that that helped with her scientific observation.
Yes, I think it's really, really fascinating. And if you haven't already, of course, we encourage you to see the exhibition where there is a whole section there talking specifically about her interest in the natural world and these moments of taking time to slow down, see what is around her, and really begin to develop incredible skill as a draftsperson, crafting illustrations of what she saw around her. It's amazing.
I totally agree. In fact, Helen and I were in the exhibition this morning, and I looked at her and I said, you know, this just never gets old. Seeing all her art just does something to me inside. It's just so absolutely amazing. So that's part of her scientific observation. You know, she was allowed, her parents gave her a microscope. She would also take photographs with her father and then draw things afterwards. And talking about the scientific observation, I was in the exhibition this morning. That mushroom, I just have to say, that mushroom, has everybody been to the exhibition to see this? You need to go. I said to Andrew, I want to go hug the mushroom, but I was afraid the guard might tell me not to, but he said I could hug it, so anyway, sorry to digress on that one.
There's a secret mushroom, but it's not much of a secret because when you walk in, you will see it.
You can't miss it.
And you are welcome to hug it if you so desire. So she starts in some ways with this observing the natural world around her, but then very quickly she moves towards storytelling. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about how Beatrix became a storyteller.
Yes, I can tell you about that. One of the interesting things I noticed in the exhibition this morning was there was a letter from her father to Beatrix, and there was actually an illustration right in the letter. And I thought, well, that's probably part of how she started telling these stories. She also was, because she was from an upper middle class family, she had nannies and governesses. And I think they would read her lots of fairy tales and all kinds of stories. So I think that was part of the base of her being able to tell stories. Then she went on to write the famous picture letters that she would write to children. And that was part of her storytelling as well. What I found so interesting about those letters, it was a precursor to her books because she was really good at putting the text and illustrations even in those picture letters to of course, the famous one, Noel. And the third thing, I think, as a storyteller that I don't think I've had thought about until recently, back in those days, people corresponded by letters, yes. Writing long letters. I can remember those days, too. I'm that old. What's this? But that I have a friend who's involved with the society, and she collected copies of Beatrix Potter's letters. She just wanted them for her own personal collection. But at the last count, there were over 2,000 letters that she wrote. So everything from writing to children, writing to her parents, writing to relatives, Also, later in life, when she became a farmer, a sheep farmer, there was a lot of business things that went on in her letters as well. And I think that was part of her storytelling. And I think that was part of it.
100%. And I'm so glad that you mentioned about how letter writing was so core to her practice. You'll get to see in that exhibition, too, the letter to Noel that you just mentioned.
The original letter that kind of gives me little palpitations every time I see it. That's one thing that never gets old to me, to see that letter.
Incredible. Yeah. So it's the first example of one of her fully illustrated stories. And it wasn't something that she designed for publication. Noel, of course, was the child of her governess. She stayed friends with the governess, but she, perhaps even more importantly, built and developed a real relationship with the child of her governess. And it wasn't the sort of thing of just sending moralizing tales of Aesop's fables, although she liked and appreciated Aesop's fables or the Grimm fairy tale. She also just looked at the world around her and saw how animals reacted to one another and developed these whimsical vignettes that then she shared with the young people.
Right, and I think that scientific observation really helped with those animal illustrations because they're very spot on, even in her little books. And just to get back to that famous letter to Noel Moore, she started that letter, which I find really interesting. That letter says, "I don't know, dear Noel, I don't know what to write to you, so I shall tell you the story of 4 little rabbits, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail, and Peter." And we know the rest of that story, but it is interesting that she started doing that. And even later in life, writing the miniature letters to children, which are also in the exhibition.
Yes, there are so many ways that she plays with scale that I think are fascinating, both in the drawings themselves, but also the size of the things, and then the coded letters, too.
Oh, yeah. And thank you for reminding me about that, because in her storytelling, I think that was also really important, was that she kept a journal. She kept a journal from the age of 13 to the age of 30. And it was done in code, secret code. But it was kind of funny. I tell in my talks there, when she wrote the word to, T-O, she would put the numeral 2. So I said she was like a precursor to texting back then. I like to think that. She was a visionary, but not that much. But she wrote this journal, and so when she died, there was a gentleman named Leslie Linder who started collecting her works. And he actually deciphered the code and did the Journal of Beatrix Potter. And unfortunately, there wasn't anything really juicy in it. No torrid love affairs or anything, but there were some amusing things, her talking about what she thought of her parents' friends and those kinds of things. So.
Which is a great moment, too. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, this is all well and good, but you've got a lot of sheep in the background.
I know. I couldn't help myself.
What is happening?
I can't help myself.
Can you tell us about these sheep?
Yes, I can. I'm totally infatuated with Herdwick sheep, and I was just in the UK in September, and my friend, I said, "Oh, I want to get some pictures of Herdwick sheep because I have a friend that does watercolors that paint. She loves Herdwick sheep too, so I wanted to get some pictures for her." And then when they asked me to send images, I just thought, oh, this would be kind of relaxing to watch the sheep. So the deal on the Herdwick sheep, there is something about it in the exhibition as well, that Beatrix really championed this breed. After she married William Heelis in 1913, her life dramatically changed. She became a farmer, a sheep farmer, a country woman, and she started championing these sheep. Now they have very, very heavy wool that mostly is used for carpeting. And I remember when I first got involved with the society, I thought, oh, wouldn't that be fun to get a Herdwick sheep wool sweater, you know? And so back then they actually sold them. They don't do that anymore. But it was so thick, it stood up by itself. And I thought, I live in New England, but the cold isn't that bad. But it was that kind of, look at that face. I can't stand it, that face. It just, he's talking to me. She really championed them, and then at some point she became very interested and started showing them in shows in Herdwick, in sheep trials, and she won many, many awards. Also the brand, the H brand for Helis, that was her married name, is there in the exhibition. And also, as I say, the wool is used for that. They're starting to make wool like yarn for those knitters. There is Herdwick sheep wool yarn, and they are used for meat as well. But there was a new, just a little aside, there was a new attraction in the Lake District. It's called the Herdwick Sheep Experience. So when I was there in September, we went there, and it's at one of Beatrix Potter's, the farms that she owned, Yew Tree Farm. And there are several Herdwick sheep that are actually been tamed by Joe McGrath, who runs this experience. So we got to go up in the field and hug sheep for the day. I'll tell you, I was in heaven anyway, so that was really fun. But she also championed another breed, another type of animal. They were Galloway cows. I don't have any pictures of them, but she felt that they were very strong and that she got them. And just to remind you, because I don't think they call them that in England, but we call them Oreo cows. Does everybody know what I mean by Oreo cows? So they're black, but with a white stripe around their body, so they look like Oreos. That's what, I don't know if that was part of it as well.
Super helpful. And I really also like the way that this helps us see too how she grew over time, right? That she started observing what was immediately around her. She started then writing these stories. Her world in some ways is broadening, but then she really did end up finding a home for herself in the Lake District. So could you tell us a little bit more, in addition to the animals, how did she see herself as a person in the Lake District?
Oh, she was a happy person in the Lake District. She, to give you a little bit of a backstory, that she started, when The Tale of Peter Rabbit became so successful, she bought Hilltop, which is a farm that's open to the public in near Surrey. And then she continued to buy more property as she was making more money from her various books and her other projects. And through those, she did a lot of real estate transactions. And she had her solicitor, William Helis. He did the transactions, and it turned out that they were married. They fell in love, and they were married in 1913. Now, I was just looking it up because I totally forgot about this. There was an age difference, too. Beatrix was about, I think, in like 48. I wish I had my notes with me, and he was like 8 years younger when they married. But Willie was, that William Helis, Willie was really impressed with Beatrix, this woman from London that really wanted to really love the Lake District, and he could tell her love for it and that kind of thing, and that she was interesting, and her life really totally changed after she married William Helis. In fact, at the society, we refer to her as Beatrix Potter before she was married, and Mrs. Helis is after. And she also called herself Beatrix Helis, so you'll see her letters signed that way as well. But she really embraced the Lake District. She started buying these farms. She also started managing the farms, too. So she had to be very organized. She was a very shrewd businesswoman, and she really knew her stuff. She became a quick study, but she was involved in nature. And I also just want to backtrack a little bit. What really put that seed in her to want to buy those farms and preserve land was because she met a man named Hardwick Rawnsley back in 1888, when her parents were renting Ray Castle, and he was the vicar there. And it turns out that Hardwick Rawnsley was one of the founders of the National Trust. So as Beatrix was young then, probably 20, and he really, I think, instilled that whole thing about land preservation, conservation, that kind of thing. And that was something that really stuck with Beatrix. And I think when Beatrix died in 1943, in her will, she left 15 farms and 4,000 acres to the National Trust. And I feel, I say this is my personal opinion, I love her little books, we all love her little books, but I think that was one of her biggest contributions to the world, is that you can go back to that beautiful place in the UK and it's somewhat untouched. And they're all working farms still.
It's amazing, too, in the way that you're describing this, that she had this vision for what the Lake District was as a home for her, and it extended beyond her, that she had a sense that she wanted others to experience this, not just today, but into the future, and she cared very deeply about preservation. I wonder if you could speak to that. I know that there's some back and forth sometimes about conservation. Preservation.
You know, conservation, I'm not a conservationist, so if anybody's in the audience, but I think of conservation as kind of working at conserving something, whereas preserving is more like just keeping it the way it was. I don't know if that's a good explanation. So it wasn't like she was trying to change things to conserve them, but it was this preservation. The farm buildings look virtually the same. They're actual working farms, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that resonates with me to the degree that preservation here often was also about culture. She was thinking about how these farms exist and how other people in decades, even centuries forward, might be able to see what she saw as this great beauty of how these sheep are tended, the culture that surrounds this, and then be able to carry it forward.
Exactly, exactly.
You mentioned earlier, too, a little bit about her as an entrepreneur. I wonder if we could circle back to that for a moment.
I love that part about her as well. You know, I think that's that's kind of just gets me excited to be so passionate about Beatrix Potter, because she was such a visionary. She was an entrepreneur because when she got the letter back from Noel Moore to make into The Tale of Peter Rabbit, she did we call it privately printed edition. So that was just, you know, we do self-publishing now, right? I mean, but she just decided to do that. She couldn't afford to have it done all in color. She had the frontispiece done in color and the rest were done in black and white. And then she ended up convincing the publisher to publish it after a lot of turndowns, and that's how that worked. But she was thinking entrepreneurially about producing this book. She only had like 450 privately printed copies made. Once The Tale of Peter Rabbit became quite famous, much to her surprise, which is just, you know, blows me away, and just a little segue, I always like to say that when she had those books done, she wanted them in that small size so that they could fit into little children's hands and that they were economical. But she went on to do other things that she called her sideshows. We have an example of it down over in the exhibition of Jemima Puddle Duck. There's a wonderful little stuffed animal that she designed from that book. She had that design because she felt Harrods didn't do a good job. She had other places look at it, but she had that done. She even developed the Peter Rabbit race game. That's also in the exhibition. And she did a number of other things. I noticed some chintz fabric. She had wallpaper, all kinds of things that she called her sideshow. So that was part of her entrepreneurial thing. But once she became Mrs. Heelis and became really dedicated more to her farming and sheep farming, she opened up a tea room in one of her farms. It's Yew Tree Cottage. And she did that as an entrepreneurial thing. But she also wanted people to see the farm, to really experience the architecture, Lakeland architecture, and that is what she did. She also, I'm getting off track, but she also wanted her house in the Hilltop left as an example of Lakeland architecture. She didn't want it as Beatrix Potter's house, but obviously, let's see what happened. She also loved to collect furniture. So she had lots of furniture, so she was able to fill up Castle Cottage, where she and Willie lived their happy married life. and then Hilltop, which was like a secondary place that she would meet visitors and those kinds of things. So she did have a real sense of place. She loved her houses, she loved the furniture, she loved all that.
It's fun too. I think in the exhibition you get to see little glimpses of this. There is a photograph of Hilltop in the exhibition, and several items actually that were hers, including her walking stick, which I know is particularly special to you.
Yes, the walking stick was Beatrix Potter's, and if you look at the little card, it says it's owned by the Beatrix Potter Society. But it's an interesting story how that walking stick came to the society. A lot of you probably know, I hope all of you know, the author Maurice Sendak, who wrote Where the Wild Things Are. He lived in Connecticut. He was a big enthusiast of Beatrix Potter. He wrote many essays about her. He was very influenced by her work. Now, I have a friend who was an editor in the UK, and she was chair of the society. I've known her for years. But she was very good friends with Maurice Sendak. And at that time, I happened to be living in Connecticut, and she would come over and visit me. So my job was driving her over to visit Maurice. What a treat that was. I mean, because Judy brought Maurice's book, Where the Wild Things Are, to the UK in the 60s. Now, that book was not accepted as well when it came out in the 60s, even for Americans, so you can imagine in the UK. But she brought it over. They did a big tour together of the book, and they just had been fast friends. So I was very lucky that I could go with Judy to see Maurice, because he just turned into a wonderful person, and he loved Judy so much. Well, Maurice Sendak owned that walking stick, along with Willie's walking stick as well. And I think what happened was Judy talked him into leaving the walking sticks to the society. And that's where the walking stick came from, is Maurice Sendak's estate. So we're very grateful to him to have those walking sticks.
It's amazing, I think, too, to realize the impact that Beatrix Potter's work has had on so many authors that we know and love.
Yes.
I think it can be very easy to imagine that these writers are just singular individual geniuses sitting all in their garret towers, but I think her life and work shows that in fact this was a much broader reach and a much deeper influence.
I agree, and she herself was influenced by people too.
Yes.
She was a real Randolph Caldecott fan, and I think there's an example of some of his work in the exhibition, and that so there were several other authors. In fact, it's interesting. I was doing in the 90s. I was being a librarian. I was doing some research and discovered that the Denver Public Library had 2 original letters from Beatrix Potter. I'm like, what? Denver? Really? You know, sorry. Hope nobody's here from Denver, but sorry. It just seemed like a little odd. But one of the things was the children's librarian back in the 1920s at the Denver Public Library had a project and wrote to all these famous authors and asked them what their favorite books were as children. And it was very interesting to, Beatrix wrote back, and she said, now, of course, I can't remember.
Sorry.
But she loved Bray Rabbit. That was one of the ones that she was very influenced by. Yes, you know, oh God, I'm trying to think now. But
Bray Rabbit is a really interesting one,
Yeah.
I think, because for many in our audience, that might be a familiar touchstone.
Yes.
And there's also this interesting relationship here that when I was growing up, I always thought of Beatrix Potter as kind of this British UK sensation, and I didn't realize that she had all these connections to America and to Americans. I wonder if you could share a bit about that,
I would
too.
love to talk to you about that. Yes, Beatrix Potter really had, she thought Americans, especially the ones from New England, she was quoted as saying, were really quite wonderful. She doesn't know what to think of.
You would emphasize the New England
I know.
ones.
Sorry, guys. Could I fib and say Georgia? No, I'm kidding. But she said, I don't know what to think of you as a nation with a capital N, but all the people I've met from New England have been wonderful. She first started, her first relationship with an American was in the 1920s when the head of Children's Services, Anne Carroll Moore, came to visit her. She had written ahead, like you do in those days, to say, "Can I come visit you?" And Anne Carroll Moore was over in France distributing Beatrix Potter books to children that were affected by World War I. And she came to visit Beatrix Potter, and they just really hit it off. First she came for tea, then she was asked to stay for dinner, and then she was asked to stay overnight, which was totally unheard of for something like that, because Beatrix was very kind of a shy person, but they just seemed to really hit it off. I think one of the things that Beatrix Potter appreciated about her American friends was that they really respected her writings and thought of them as children's literature, not just these like oft-coming cute little children's books, that these were serious pieces of children's literature. She went on to meet, she never met her actually, is Bertha Mahoney Miller. And Bertha Mahoney Miller was she ran the bookshop for girls and boys in Boston. She also did the Hornbook, which is a famous children's literature magazine that's still being published today. And so she was asked to write an article, Beatrix, about herself, that kind of thing. But she really respected Bertha because of the attitude about her books in the United States, that they were really appreciated. And just as another little side story, there was a piece of property in the Lake District on Windermere, this beautiful lake, that was in threat of development. And Beatrix decided wanted to raise some money to buy this so that it wouldn't get developed. And so she wrote to Bertha Mahoney Miller and sent her 50 original illustrations, copies from Peter Rabbit. And so Bertha Mahoney Miller ended up selling them to all Americans and raised enough money to buy this piece of property called Cockshot Point in the lakes. So I think there's another entrepreneurial thing too. There's a good fundraiser, when you think about it, just back then, that she was able to do that. And one of the rumors, which I always like to keep going, it's sort of an urban legend, is that somewhere we read that Rose Kennedy bought several for her children as well, but we haven't been able to authenticate that, unfortunately. But it makes for a good story, so.
And if there's one thing Beatrix Potter fans can come for, it's a good story.
That's true. You got it, Andrew. And that's Utri right there. I can see. That's where she had the tea room, and that's where the Herdwick experience is, too.
Yes.
Yep.
So obviously there is so much to her life, and there's only so much time we have here, so I would love now actually to open it up for some questions. Betsy is a font of knowledge about Beatrix Potter's life, and I know a dabbling from working on this show.
You're doing good, Andrew.
Yeah. Thank you.
So this isn't so much a question as just a comment that I've lived with rabbits for the last 25 years, and there's only 2 authors that I think depict them really, really well, Beatrix Potter and Richard Adams. So,
Thank you.
I love that acknowledgement too of how much Beatrix's scientific observation translated into something that was real to life in its own way. Like, yes, they have sort of funny relationships with one another that are human or at least anthropomorphic, but they also relate to one another as real animals, which I think is part of what sets her work apart.
Hi, my friend and I were talking about when we read these books as children, we were terrified of Mr. McGregor. And I never read any of the other books but until I was like a teenager. I have the whole collection my granny gave me when I was 17. So there's so much, to me, violence in them. And they're very engaging. The illustrations are so beautiful, but some of the stories, especially Mr. McGregor. And back then, was it considered a violent thing to read about, wanting to skin the little baby bunnies and cut off their heads? And you know.
Well, you have to say that, she and her brother collected skeletons or got the animals and boiled them. So I think that's where her imagination went wild. I mean, being a children's librarian, I think when you look back at those books, yes, there were violence, but that was kind of predictable back then in that kind of literature. It was just the way it happened. And that's just my take on it. I don't know, Andrew.
I agree. I think when we look at stories, especially stories that we've lived with for a long time for young people, I mean, to me, our example here would be Grimm's fairy tales, right?
Yeah.
If we're looking at, God bless Little Red Riding Hood, or any of these where it's just like everyone has death and destruction or illness at all times. And I think it comes from a society that held violence somewhat differently. It wasn't necessarily condoned, but it was recognized as frankly, a part of many people's lives. It's interesting, you all may know that the Alliance Theater, each time now that we have one of these children's picture book exhibitions, they commission a new play in response, in conjunction. So they now have a new play called Into the Burrow. It's adorable, but they really struggled when they were making it with the story of Peter's father. Because if you remember the story, Peter's father had an accident and got baked into a pie. So it's, it's kind of straightforward.
Oh, just that?
Yeah. And so as they were thinking, how do we make live theater about this? Theater for very young audiences, like, how do we do this and not traumatize young people in front of us? But what they came around to saying was, it wasn't that she was treating this lightly. It was more the way that they are holding it in the story is, yeah, it's something real that happens, and actually, it's almost artificial when we pretend death doesn't happen, or that life doesn't move on to have hard moments. So it's more, I think, at least you'll see in the play that they've created, something that they acknowledge that it happens, and they think about how then to extend care after something happens. And I would argue that that's a through line throughout the books as well. Beatrix's work is so matter-of-fact about things that can appear to be really violent, and she always circles back to what is the fundamental relationship between these characters? How are they having reactions, interactions that have some sense of an ethical core that, now I'm really moving into interpretation.
Yeah.
But I think that there is a way that you could read it to see something here that isn't just violence for violence sake, for example. So one possibility.
Nice answer, yes.
You're like, well, speaking of interpretations over there.
Hello. I wanted to preface my question by saying that I enjoyed so much Beatrix Potter's books as a child, and then as a parent, and now in the last few years has been rediscovering them as a grandparent, and they just are timeless, aren't they? Multi-generational. My question is, once Beatrix Potter married and got into farming and other entrepreneurial activities, did she stop writing? Were all her books published as a younger adult?
It's interesting. She only wrote most of the 23 little books over a short period of time.
Okay.
It was like 13 years. After, of course, her publisher was trying to get her to do more and more, a lot of pressure. She did a book called Fairy Caravan later in life, but it was a compilation of a lot of stories she had started writing with illustrations. She was even sort of embarrassed. I shouldn't say embarrassed. She ended up having that book published here in the United States because she just didn't feel comfortable doing it in the UK. There was an edition that was done. There were some other things that she did, but not like, she did a Peter Rabbit Almanac in 1929. But the other thing, I think, because of her farming interests, as well as her eyesight began to fail her. And you really need to have good eyesight to do those kinds of illustrations.
Right.
So I think that was a difficulty for her as well. So,
not
that's,
just writing, but she also stopped drawing as well, perhaps.
yeah.
Yes, and I would argue that it's more of a transition to different forms of making because, and you see this in the exhibition too, some of the early works is really finely rendered line drawing. You see every hair on the mouse, for example, whereas some of the later work are these stunning watercolors of landscape, right? So I think it also, it parallels her trajectory in terms of interests, but it also, I think, reflects where she is as a human in
Right.
relation to the types of making.
Yeah, so interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
I was just curious, what were her reactions to like the suffrage movement when she was living in London, and then to other big events because she lives through, you know, the 20s, the 30s, you know, what were her reactions? Do we have those, are those preserved in her letters?
I didn't get that. Really.
Yeah.
Can you try to start it?
Sure, I'm happy to
Okay.
start. I will say, gender is something that I think you can read as a through line through a lot of what she did. The place that we have focused on it in the exhibition is really around her relationship with entrepreneurial strategies and with capital. She came from a well-to-do family, but the money was controlled by the father. And there was a sense that she had to follow the family. And part of the joy of these books getting published then, in part, was she then had her own money. Which opened up the possibility of doing different things, of eventually moving to the Lake District on her own. I like the way you were talking, sorry, I'm getting away, I will come back. I like the way that you were talking about her relationship with Mr. Heelis, because he started out as her employee. He was her solicitor, he was her lawyer, and then it became something, so it wasn't an example of her going to find a man to hold on to, in the sense that some might view a relationship. This was a woman who, in many ways, was quite independent. And so I think we can hypothesize about her relationship with many of these movements. I think we also can see her as a civic actor in many cases. When she was thinking about what change she wanted to see around her, she was deeply concerned with the preservation of, for example, the way that these sheep were able to be cared for and the raising of the sheep. So she was writing letters to politicians and to newspapers. She signed a letter as a concerned North Country farmer, in some ways like obscuring the gender, but also using the tools she had available to her to move towards civic action. It's not a direct answer to your question on suffrage, and I'm not sure that we have...
I didn't hear this. I didn't hear you totally about the suffrage question, because that was something that she was against, which I'm sorry to say, which really bothers me. It bothers me, but that was just part of the. I'd like to think of the error, but she did talk about that as well. And can I just segue just for a minute about Willie, her husband? Beatrix was quoted in a letter writing to a friend that right after they got married, this is the quote, "I find Willie to be quite satisfactory." And when you started talking about Willie, I love that. You could take it any way you want.
So good. Yes.
We have somebody in the front. You had a question down here. Yeah, I'll do it too. Yeah, wait a minute, she's coming.
I think I'm remembering correctly that she studied mushrooms quite scientifically and seriously and tried to present a paper and was rebuffed. At what part of her life was that?
That was back in her early 20s, late teens. Yeah, we didn't really touch on any of that. That was something that she was, because of her scientific observation, she became very, very interested in mycology and fungi and did wonderful drawings that are still hold up to scientific illustration today. And she ended up writing a paper about it and having it presented at the Linnaean Society in London. Now, she had to have it presented because she couldn't, because she was a woman. And it was presented there, and they rejected it. But I feel, my personal opinion is that it could have been a whole different life for Beatrix had that paper been accepted. She was quite an extraordinary scientist. She talked about a lot with mold and mushrooms and all kinds of things. So her mushroom drawings were quite extraordinary. And that really happened to her in Scotland. She really got the love of that. And she even had a mentor named Charlie McIntosh, who was, if you saw a picture of him, you'd think, would you let your teenage daughter hang out with this guy? You know, long beard. He was a postman. He walked 30 miles a day delivering mail in Perthshire, Scotland. I mean, it's pretty funny. But he, because of all the walking he did, he had a keen observation on fungi and mushrooms. And she would send drawings to him for his critique and that kind of thing. And just a little, up in the Lake District, there's, in Ambleside, she is the Armit Library, Museum and Library. And when she died, she left most of her mushroom and fungi drawings to them. So if you're ever lucky enough to be in the UK, that's where you'll see them.
Great.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for coming and speaking. This has been so interesting.
Thank you.
I'm very interested in learning about how Peter Rabbit has become the brand that we know it as now. How involved was she in the marketing and development of Peter Rabbit as a brand?
That's a great question. One of the things that when Beatrix Potter died, she left the rights to all her books to the publisher. So they really had a free reign after that. Now, we didn't even get into that. We have a few, can I try to do a quick and dirty? Yeah.
Go for it.
Okay. So Beatrix Potter, back when The Tale of Peter Rabbit was published by Frederick Warren, that's the same publisher that is on her books now, Norman Warren started working with her, who was from the publisher. They fell in love. They got engaged, much to her parents' disapproval, because he was in trade. Back then, that was very not approved. And so they got engaged. She was allowed to have a ring from him, but it was not going to be announced publicly. That was the deal they made with the parents. And unfortunately, after they were engaged, he died 3 weeks later of pernicious anemia, which is like leukemia. But one of the things that she held in her heart her whole rest of her life was her relationship with Norman, even though and she was very, very good friends with the family. And I think that's my thinking that it was left to the publisher. So yes, there was a brand for Peter Rabbit, but it's expanded exponentially. Can I say that in a nice way? Some of it's good, some of it's bad, but that's just the way it is. So.
Along those same lines, how do you and the society, Betsy, feel about the cartoon version now for younger people? We have very young children who we've seen all the iterations of the different Potter sort of televised things, but that the animated series with, you know, Peter and Benjamin, and then I think Lily is the female character.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of originally when all those started coming out, it was kind of the old guard, you know, wouldn't like, oh my God, that's horrible. We kind of embrace it as a society because it gets her name out there and people know, get to know more about her as well. So I think that's part of it, is just people, you know, children just being exposed to her stories in a different format, you know, that kind of thing. And just while I have one more minute, I just want to talk about the film Miss Potter. Has anybody here seen the film Miss Potter? Yeah. That film was done in 2006. Renee Zellweger stars in it. I think you can get it on Netflix. And it is a really interesting film. It was not accurately portrayed. There are several things that are not right, but it is Hollywood, you know. They didn't kiss in the train station. But I think it's a real touchstone for people when I do my talks, that people have seen the film, they've been introduced to her, and thank God they actually talked about her land preservation even in that film. So I think if you can, get it from your library or just get it on Netflix because it is an interesting film.
I think so too. One small note here too, just around Potter and the storytelling around it and how it moves forward. I didn't tell you this, but this is a fun moment. I was here giving a tour a couple of days ago, and I finished the tour. I noticed there was a pretty sizable group of folks, adults, who had all congregated in there. And I was like, oh, interesting, I'll just go and see what's going on. And they unfurled a banner that said, "Will you marry me?" And these two people were in there, and it was a legit marriage proposal. And I was like, what is happening? So I went, well, first I also took a picture just because I thought it was adorable. But then I went and asked afterwards, like, why did you choose to have your Turns out, during the pandemic, this group of friends had been a pod, and their pandemic activity had been watching some of these new stories. And two of the pod members got closer than a pod. And so this was their moment to intentionally bring the whole group here. And then they had this amazing moment. So for me too, I think, yes, there are always moments when you see a story retold or extended that you're a little bit like, well, I don't know. But then sometimes there are these beautiful moments that can come from that I think are just really heartening.
So Andrew, I wonder what the wedding is going to be like. Didn't you get an invitation?
We'll have to get a full update.
Somebody in a Peter Rabbit costume or something?
Hopefully the vicar. Oh boy. Thank you so much, Betsy.
My
This has
pleasure.
been such a joy
Yeah, I
and
had
a treat.
Good time. Thank you.
We will be downstairs over here. If any of you have follow-up questions or extensions or just memories you want to share, we'd love to hear them. Thank you again for making time on this beautiful Saturday to come on out and join us. And please do enjoy the exhibition. Have a wonderful day.